Inside CISC takes you behind the scenes of one of the most iconic construction and engineering companies in Europe. This is a 165-year-old family business built on people.
To have a business that has the culture and the values, the strength of ours, particularly around care, that's probably unique, particularly in the construction world, but in any industry. We want our people to develop, we want to give them the responsibility, and we think that makes them thrive.
Places for the next generation, built on innovation. Find out more on Inside CISC.
Make Christmas for everyone at Dunnes Stores with festive savings and a fantastic selection of wines for €10 or less. Then mix and match tasty treats like 5 packs of selected Cadbury bars and large tubes of Pringles, now half price. Plus, you can save again at the till with a €10 or $50 grocery voucher. However you do your Christmas shop, make Christmas for everyone with Dunnes Stores. Terms and conditions apply. Voucher can be used in next grocery shop with €50 or more. Voucher excludes alcohol. Please drink sensibly.
Salute e salve, benvenuti ad una nuova puntata di Storia d'Italia Extra. Oggi non trasformo in podcast una diretta, ma un'intervista che ho fatto in privata sede. Ed è un'intervista che per me è veramente il coronamento di un sogno. Che dire, è qualcosa forse anche di più, perché la persona che ho intervistato, come scoprirete nel corso della nostra chiacchierata, è in realtà la ragione che mi ha spinto ad arrivare alla tarda antichità ed è quindi avuto un'influenza determinante sulla nascita del podcast. Oggi in sostanza non saremo qui senza Peter Hatter, o Peter Heater come l'ho chiamato a lungo. Ho incontrato il professor Hatter, anche lui, a Gorizia, e allora gli ho chiesto se mi avrebbe fatto il favore enorme di poterlo intervistare, ovviamente in inglese perché non parla italiano. Questa è la ragione per la quale quest'intervista finisce qui su Storia d'Italia Extra e non sul podcast principale, dove di regola io non metto nulla che non sia in italiano. Sappiatelo, ecco la ragione per cui avete diverse puntate in inglese qui, perché è un posto giusto per metterle. Comunque il professor Hatter non ha bisogno di presentazioni, è forse uno dei più grandi storici viventi e, notate, ho detto storici in generale e non solo del Medioevo, della tarda antichità, ma veramente in generale. È molto influente in quanto è considerato in sostanza il capo o la guida o il punto di riferimento della cosiddetta scuola di Oxford. Vedrete che il professor Hatter porterà gli argomenti tipici della scuola di Oxford anche nella nostra chiacchierata, quindi l'importanza delle migrazioni, l'importanza degli shock esterni, oltre che dei problemi interni all'impero per la sua caduta, ad esempio per andare ad un argomento molto importante nella storiografia. Comunque, bando alle ciance, penso che sia più importante sentir parlare il professor Hatter che me nella mia versione fanboy, quindi vi lascio all'intervista e ci sentiamo alla fine. Salute e salve, as I say at the beginning of every episode of Storia d'Italia. It's a little bit of mark from myself. Today, I often say a special day, but it's more than a special day. It's a cubic special day because I'm here with Peter Hatter. I will say I wouldn't be doing I wouldn't be a public historian. I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if it weren't for you, Professor. I got one day I entered into a bookstore and I got this book, The Fall of the Roman Empire, A New History, and I started reading and I was absolutely flabbergasted by late antiquity, which I never, up to that point, cared too much about. And from that moment onwards, I almost didn't care about to read anything else. so
no,
I like
to
exactly. It's a big responsibility. Not small, yes, but
I'll try and live with it.
Thank you so very much. And I would like to start from the beginning, from the book that I just quoted, because has a very catchy title. The Fall of the Roman Empire, A New History. And that new history did it for me, because I thought, what new could be said in the 21st century about the fall of the Roman Empire? So that's kind of my first question. What brought you to write that very, very successful book, which I suggest to everyone? It's available, of course, also in Italian translation, to write a new history about the fall of the Roman Empire?
Well, I'd say, like you, when I got hold of late antiquity, it totally absorbed me. I went to university thinking I was going to be a modern historian. I've always liked 19th and 20th century history. But my mother had ruined my mind by taking me to lots of Roman sites when I was little. And that deep-seated, deep-set preconditioning came out. So I tried a couple of late Roman courses alongside the modern ones I was doing and found I absolutely loved it. So I was sucking into it like you, really. The combination of quite a lot of sources, but not everything that you want to know. So therefore, you're always having to think in creative ways about how to make the material give you answers to the things you're interested in. That is an intoxicating intellectual cocktail for me, and I absolutely love it. So prehistory, there's not enough. Modern history, there's too much. Late antiquity, there's too much information. Late antiquity, there's just enough.
Just enough to build a coherent history, but
yes.
Not enough so that it's intellectually... I always think, in a way, I dread the time when I will get to modern history, because as you may not know, but my podcast goes in chronological order, so I always go forward. Today I'm in the 8th century. But in a few decades, I shall
you'll
reach...
be doing Italian unification.
Exactly, and I dread thinking when you start having like mountains of paper, just when you get to the bureaucratic state that keeps a record of everything. But anyway, yes, and so let's say the first thing, though, that you, if correct me if I'm wrong, the first thing that you really got into writing before you wrote that book, which is really a public history, your academic work at the origins was about the Goths, which is something.
Yes, it was.
Which is something I'm very grateful about, by the way, because I wrote a book about the Visigoths. And basically, I used all your books, source books, and the 4th century, Goths in the 4th century, all that. I used it to no end as a source. So thank you very much. So what brought you to the Goths specifically, and why, in the history of late antiquity, in general history? So why that was the first love?
Well, I knew that I wanted to work on interrelationships between the non-Roman outsiders and Roman populations. And I was talking to the person who supervised my doctoral work that this was where my interest lay. And we were trying to think of an area which hadn't been overly worked on. And he said, well, there's a couple of fragmentary Greek histories which are written in Greek from the 5th century, which record interactions between Goths primarily and different Roman populations in the Balkans. So my doctoral work was called The Goths and the Balkans. So it was about looking at that interaction. And indeed, those texts did contain some very interesting stuff on the complexity of relationships between an imperial center on the one hand, provincial Romans on the other, and Gothic groups as a third party. So it was a sort of interesting, it wasn't a two-party barbarians and Romans story. It's a three-part negotiation that's going on, which is very, very interesting. But the thesis was in the end taken over by the realization that when you read the contemporary Roman sources in order, they gave you a profoundly different vision of Gothic history from the famous Jordanes Goetica. which is written a century later than that, in the mid-6th century, and looking back over the 4th to 6th centuries. And what the Gettiker hid from all of us is the fact that things like the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths are not ancient groupings of the Gothic world that go back to the pre-invasion period, but are created on Roman soil. They're new confederations that are created on Roman soil, and that emerged as the kind of fundamental conclusion from the thesis for me. I mean, other people get different things, of course, but for me, the big take was actually the period of invasions changed the invaders as much as it changed the Roman Empire.
Yeah, and that's a very, very interesting insight. And nowadays, I would say it's almost universally accepted. I would say almost universally, because so that Greutungi, I don't know in English, Greutungi, and Tervingi are groups that are different from Visigoths and Ostrogoths, and and indeed. And one thing that I really loved about reading your early books was also how you had to interact with the archaeology of the area, which was very sparse and almost all done by the Soviet Union. So in Russian, right? So in a way, was also bringing
Russian-Romanian,
or Romanian, right? So or Romanian and Russian-Romanian. So also bringing in a way all that study which had been done in the former communist bloc to the West, if I read correctly. What happened?
That's right. I was very lucky that I was working just late enough that the Soviet Union had relaxed some of its intellectual hold on this early history. So, if I'd been writing in the 70s rather than the 80s, a lot of information would have been constrained into an ideologically correct, in inverted commas, view of the past. But actually that had been blown open by a wonderful Russian archaeologist who I did get to meet once, Mark Shukin, who had said, no, this stuff around the Black Sea is not early Slavs. That was the thing, because it was this the area of Gothic domination produces really interesting remains in the from the late 3rd through to the early 5th century. Then everyone wanted them to be Slavic, because what the Soviet Union was interested in was the origin of the Slavs. We said, no, the date's completely wrong. This is actually Goth, and it's just like the stuff, or it's very like the stuff that you find in Poland a bit before. So,
and that's where you make the connection, Wilbark with Chernikov, and then also
exactly. It's fundamentally his work. I obviously thought about it very carefully and double-checked what I thought, but he's a great man and had great students too, and I've met several of those. So he's the guy who put his head above the parapet in the trenches and might have had it shot off. So I think proper respect where it's due. Being intellectually brave in the Soviet Union was a different kettle of fish to being intellectually brave in the West.
Yeah. I understand what you're saying. I understand. But it's really fascinating, all this archaeology, because you see so many things. People, even today when I explain it, I always get the attention of people when I start talking about the factory making glass in the area of the Goths, or the little towns bordering cities. The villa, I remember it's also in the book, the villa, which looks like a Roman villa built in the area of the Tervingi. So it's all archaeology, very, very interesting, which challenges the understanding that most people have of the Barbaricum today. So of course not in academia,
and more stuff has appeared since I wrote. So the exciting new stuff, you may have come across it too, is that in the aftermath of the defeat of Decius in the early 270s, there's a sudden flood of gold coins. Some of them are real gold coins, and some of them are local copies of Roman gold. I say real Roman gold coins. Some are copies, and it looks like this is very much the victor of the Battle of Abritus celebrating his victory and creating this coinage. Suddenly minting coins already in the 270s. It's an astonishing moment, and it re-emphasizes the point you're making, that we shouldn't underestimate the sort of ambition and partial sophistication of the kind of warlords who were appearing around the fringes of the Roman Empire in that period.
Yeah, it's of course there is an influence, right, that you can see, across the decades, and then they have this tremendous happening of the arrival of the Huns, which is almost like stopping an evolution. It looks like a state formation on the border of the Roman Empire. If we would have continued unencumbered, this is of course not nothing particularly original to say, but probably some form of state would have eventually emerged there. But yeah, as you also brilliantly put it, that invasion of the Huns is really something which, and this is the central part of the thesis of the other book I was talking about before, the arrival of the Huns as a major event which changes European history, if I summarize.
No, I mean that's what I do think. I mean, I think the point to hold on to is that we have these two large clusters of groups, in two chronological clusters of groups moving over into the Roman Empire, one in the second half of the 370s, one in the first decade of the 5th century. And these are not like anything else that happens. These are very unusual movements in their scale and their concentration. They're not normal. They're not normal frontier events at all. There's not even anything like them in the 3rd century, really, and certainly not in the 4th. So we've got something odd is happening here in that 25-year period, 25 years or so. And the Roman sources are absolutely 100% that the Huns caused the first of those clusters.
Yeah.
And people have tried to undermine that, I think really unsuccessfully. You can put an argument together, but it involves making less probable choices, not impossible choices, but much less probable choices from what the source material says. And actually, I think, the only reasonable response is that the contemporary Roman commentators knew what they were talking about.
But even archaeology doesn't contradict. The archaeology, from what I read, doesn't contradict at all. Sometimes the two are not in accord, so you can say maybe the sources misinterpreted. But when they both are in agreement, it's a bit harder to. Yes, the first is pretty obvious, and I know that the second connection, so that is more contentious. So the one...
It is much more contentious. And basically, our Roman sources for that second one just concentrate on the effects on Roman soil once the people have crossed the frontier. They have almost nothing to say about why they ended up there as they survive. I mean, I think we do have this... early 5th century Greek source, Olympiodorus of Thebes, but it only survives in fragments. I'm pretty certain from the hints in the bits that survive that Olympiodorus would have told us. I mean, it's one of the frustrations of my life.
That bit it's like Ammianus Marcellinus we have, but we don't have Olympiodorus, right? And indeed, from the little pieces, he seems like a very good historian. From the little that survives.
I totally agree. The detail of the information and the precision of the writing is very good indeed. And I would say he seems to be less of a literary artist, say, than Ammianus. And Ammianus will take liberties with exact factual precision in order to make for a good piece of writing from time to time. But Olympiodorus doesn't seem to do that. I mean, he really does seem to sort of just get the material out there in chronological order.
He even tells us about the level of, if I'm correct, level of income of senators in Rome. Maybe it was him, maybe not. I'm just going by memory. But,
yes, it is him. Yeah.
Yeah. So
and he gives a wonderfully precise account of Alaric's negotiations with the imperial court when Alaric is sitting outside Rome. It's mostly preserved in Zosimus and Sozomen rather than Olympiodorus' original, but it's gold dust. It's real gold dust, and it doesn't get used often to the extent that it should get used, because it's telling you some really important things if you bother to read it carefully. But yes, so no one tells us what causes the second set of invasions. Radagaisus into Italy, the Rhine crossing of the Vandals, Alans and Suevi, and also there's one Hunnic king, Uldin, who clears off. All of these people are coming out of what's now Hungary, Slovakia, Austria, that kind of area. They're all leaving the same area, interestingly, but no one tells us what is making them leave. So a difference of opinion is perfectly reasonable in that sense. Much more reasonable than trying to pretend that the Huns didn't cause the arrival of the Goths in 376. Nonetheless, so you have to put together an argument as to why you think they left. And again, I think you can make the most likely argument, in my view, is that it's actually a replay further west of the events of the 370s, and we're actually seeing the Huns move into the Middle Danube. And the best reason for thinking that is again from Olympiodorus, because he goes on a diplomatic mission to the Hunnic leaders in about 412, and he's going to the Middle Danube. He's going to Hungary, Slovakia, there or thereabouts. So the Huns weren't there before 405, and suddenly they're there in 412.
Yeah, they were more in Ukraine, in modern Ukraine.
Absolutely. There's no sign of them. There's no sign of them west of the Carpathians in large numbers before that time.
There's something about this Pannonian basin, what today is Hungary, that seems really to attract nomadic people across the millennia. This was not one of the questions which I proposed to you, but it's really interesting. But why is it so? Because I see all the time...
It's kind of the Great Hungarian Plain, the Puszta, is an extension in geographical terms of the Western Steppe. So you do get these grasslands, and you're absolutely right. The other reason why it looks very plausible to have the Huns move in two stages, first of all to the eastern side of the Carpathians, and then secondly onto the Great Hungarian Plain, the Puszta, is because Avars did exactly that, and Magyars did exactly that later. This is how large-scale militarized nomadic groups intrude into Europe. They get as far as Ukraine to start with, and then they work out where you can go, and actually the Hungarian Puszta looks pretty nice, and that's much closer to rich places that you can raid. So, chance of raiding Italy rather than raiding the Balkans, I know if I'm a nomad, what I'm putting my money on,
it's a nice place. Yeah, it's a nice place for the horses.
It's very nice.
And good places around too. Good places to ride around. So all very good. Indeed, even the Mongols tried to do that. So it goes all the way to the 13th century. So now I have to make you, because I have you now, and you can't escape. No, I'm kidding. But I have to make you the most dreaded question that I can possibly face when they ask me. So, and I know it's one of the most dreaded question, at least for me. Maybe for you is a fantastic question, but it's basically when I get. So why did the Roman Empire fall? They usually don't add Western, but I will add it for you. So Western Roman Empire fall, because that's the central thesis of the book. And I will say, I'll make you the question, but I'll also make you an additional question: is what your work and the work of, if I can call it your school, has brought to this debate, which is raging today as it did 200 years ago.
What my line of trajectory of intellectual thought brings to it? Well, two things, I think. First of all, a real concentration on the outside element. I mean, there's no one who's at all sensible who thinks that it isn't, and we're talking about the fall of the Western Empire, that it isn't some kind of combination of internal and external factors.
Yeah, it's only the percentage, right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So it always strikes me it's a bit like, a strange cooking game show where you have a cake, which is the end result, and you have to guess what ingredients go in to make the cake. You know?
Nice. I will take that analogy and I will run with it another time. For sure, I will use it again. It's fantastic. Yes, you have the
There's
cake.
this bizarre British game show called The Great British Bake Off, which is all about baking.
Yeah, perfect.
And I was watching.
Perfect.
I don't watch it very often, but I was watching one episode, and it just struck me that we
So,
all know the end result. It's how do we get there?
more flour or more sugar or more eggs, right?
Yeah.
So no one is
So,
saying it's only sugar or it's only eggs, right? It's not
Absolutely. Well,
only
no one is
external.
sensible.
Yeah, no one that is sensible. Nothing. No one. The School of Vienna, School of Oxford, School of Toronto. They disagree on the amount of ingredients, basically.
Exactly so. So my interest is, and it runs through actually all of my work beyond this stuff on the fall of the empire, is actually the way in which, and it comes back to that central conclusion that I came to in my thesis about the Goths, that the process changed the Goths as much as it changed the empire. It's thinking about the way that interactions with more complex, more developed societies change those groups around the fringes.
Mm-hmm.
So a really big line of thought, which I think I've contributed, is identifying the fact that groups like the Visigoths, as led by Alaric, or the Vandal-Alan coalition led to North Africa by Gaiseric, that these are new confederations created on Roman soil, and that they are larger. I mean, some people resist that conclusion because they don't want it, but the evidence is really overwhelming that these things are larger than anything that had existed before. They are gatherings of pre-existing groups. And indeed, that's the point, because the Romans don't like them. They do try and destroy them. And if they hadn't gathered together in larger groups, the Romans would have destroyed them. They have a very good go at destroying the Vandals, Alans. That confederation only forms because of Roman military counteraction. And actually the Tervingi and the Greutungi uniting to fight the Battle of Hadrianople. Again, if they'd only been... If they'd been separate groups, there's every reason to think that Valens and Gratian would have defeated them. So, the size is important because it allows you to survive on Roman soil. So that I think is one really important contribution that I think I've made and that I would be very ready to defend. The other is then to think about how that intersects with the way that the Roman imperial system works. And it's really a kind of laser-like concentration on the fact that the heart of the imperial system, as we have it by the 4th century, the way that it has evolved, is that provincial landowning communities raise money from themselves. I mean, they basically run the tax system in their localities. They pay it to the center, and the center maintains military forces which protect them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, it's an exercise in managed devolution. This is a pre-modern state over a vast area. It cannot control the minutiae of life, everywhere from Hadrian's Wall to Hippo in North Africa. It can't do that, and it doesn't try to do that. It would be mad to do that. So local communities run themselves, but there's kind of a deal here at the heart of things. That the center, you hand over a portion of your resources to the center maintains military forces which protect you.
Mm-hmm.
If we think about what the arrival on West Roman soil of outside military forces like the Visigoths, Vandals, Alans, Sueves primarily, but then also Burgundians a bit later, what that does to this system, they start to alienate bits of that provincial tax base.
Mm-hmm.
So their very existence starts to cut away at the flow of revenues that the centre needs to maintain its armed forces. And the best guesses are that the Roman state would have spent something like 75% of its tax revenues on the army. That's what pre-modern states that maintain professional armies. It's there or thereabouts. That's not a stretch guess. That's a perfectly ordinary sort of guess. So once you start cutting away from the flow of revenues, and also it's not just territories that they settle on, it's territories that they damage. We have legal evidence for the kind of tax remissions that areas extract if they've been fought over. So in central and southern Italy, where Alaric had been. A decade later, they're still only paying about 1/9 of the tax revenues that they previously paid. Now, that's full of a very powerful political constituency, Roman senators, who I guess are best placed to get the best possible tax break. But it's telling you that damaged places don't pay you very much. And
there's a lot of
there's
them.
Comparative evidence.
And there's a lot of damaged places in the 5th century.
There are a lot of damaged places in the 5th century. So the Roman state is now struggling to fund armed forces sufficient to continue to protect the landowners. And the position of the landowners is very interesting. I mean, again, this picks up from what I was thinking about when I was writing that thesis about the Balkans. The provincial communities, their wealth is based on land. You know, they can't move. They can't go anywhere else. You know, your estate is where it is. You can't sell it, and you can't pick it up and move it to somewhere that the Central Roman state is still capable of protecting. It's where it bloody is. And, you know, if it starts to appear that the West Roman state is not able to protect you anymore because it can't maintain the level of armed force that will encompass your area as well as more core areas, then you've got no choice but to try and do a deal, if you can, with whoever is emerging.
And in fact, it's very telling that the actual central army, and this was not clear to me until I started studying this, that the central army actually retreated to Italy and maintained at the end the control of Italy. So there is that sense of continuously shrinking core area, which is defended at the end. So Italy is not, it is defended until the end, but afterwards, you could say. But provincials are left more and more to the werewolves. So maybe a deal with the werewolves is better than paying taxes which are not actually effective in protecting what's most important to us.
No, absolutely. I think that's a very reasonable way to think about the 5th century, that more and more provincial communities, as the time goes by, are jettisoned, and the centre concentrates its control on Italy and, you know, maybe just over the Alps as well. So Britain goes first, Northern Gaul, parts of extremities of the Hispanic Peninsula go pretty early by the 420s. Then after the 450s, we start to lose control of Aquitaine and Burgundy, Provence, and eventually northeastern Spain as well. So it is a kind of shrinking. And I think you're absolutely right, because to my mind, the really critical source is the new bit that was added to the Notitia Dignitatum in the early 420s, which shows you the distributio numerorum, as Jones christened it, which shows you two things. One, that about 50% of the standing regiments of the West Roman army as they existed in 395, so after the last bout of major civil war, half of those have been destroyed in the period between 395 and it dates to about 422, 423. So half of those have been destroyed, but they have been replaced, but most of them been replaced by regrading Limitanei and frontier troops to be field army troops, not by recruiting new field army troops. And that's surely reflecting a shortage of funds. So and actually the archaeology from the Rhine might suggest that local Frankish groups are now manning the frontier defences, presumably being paid through halfpenny, you know, a small amount. And you've pulled back the Limitanei and turned them into field army troops.
So the Franks are the Limitanei, and basically, and the former Limitanei are now field armies, but there is a diminished defense available for Gaul.
Yes, there's a huge diminution in the overall military capacity. I mean, it reminds me a little bit of, you know, Hitler's situation maps in spring 1945 have all his old regiments lined up against the advancing Russian forces, but, you know, each of those tank regiments now only has 4 tanks in it, not 150. We're not quite there in the 420s, but I think that's where we get to by the 450s and 460s.
So we have talked about the West. Of course, we could talk 4 more hours about the West, but for I want to get also to other things.
Can I just make one more point about
please.
The West very quickly, and that is this: the internal weaknesses of the imperial structure are obviously crucial here. This kind of fault line between provincial communities and the imperial center, and the crucial fiscal military access. Can the center protect that or not? The one extra thought I'd throw in is, and it seems to me this is where those who want to say barbarians are secondary and the internal factors are primary, you've got to find a narrative progression that allows for provincial communities to be able to break away from the center without barbarians being present on Roman soil, for the internal argument to work. Because that's basically the alternative argument, is that
they could have split up anyways, let's say.
Absolutely. So you've got to get a narrative progression that allows that to happen. And that, I think, is just absolutely impossible, because we have centralized the army by the 4th century into these field army units that are under direct imperial control. There isn't military force in the provinces to stand up to the central army. Britain tries to go it alone a few times and is always stopped on. And that just gives you the model. Unless and until you can break up that overwhelming preponderance of force that exists around the imperial center, it is impossible for the provincial communities to break away. And that, I think, is the fundamental weakness with the internal argument, is that they don't ever provide a narrative as to how you undermine the military force at the center without barbarians eroding the tax base that funded it. So that would be the intellectual challenge I would throw down, as it were, to those who think differently to myself, is show me how it could happen without barbarians on Roman soil.
Because indeed, in the 4th century, we have several cases where as you said, the furthest province and probably the least important, which is Britain at the time, tries several times to break away, and several times the imperial government, even if it's not so important to them, from what I can see, they still use overwhelm.
They don't rush to do it.
They don't rush. They say, okay, you can have 10 years. You can have 10 years. But then eventually, as soon as we can, we will bring this overwhelming force. And, they are almost the last successful invasions that really conquer Britain. You have this 4th century at the time of Theodosius, the Elder, right? So with this incredible... But indeed, even other pieces, North Africa doesn't seem to have the possibility to break away.
That's right. Even the Gildo thing, it only lasts 2 years, In other words, while there might be a kind of centrifugal desire in the provinces, there is no practical way for it to happen until you break up the military strength at the center. And I don't see how you do that without the barbarians being there.
Clear. And indeed, that introduces also the other question which I had, which was the East, because we see in the East, in fact, that no provincial area breaks away until the Arabs arrive, and the Arabs conquer it. They don't. So the East is the other another question which I had. Fantastic book which I have here, Rome Resurgent, that it deals mostly with Justinian time and this age of reconquest of Justinian towards the West. And the things that really was eye-opening for me when I read that book. Luckily, it came out just when I was about to cover Justinian, so I read it avidly. And the thing that really, there's a lot of things, of course, in the book, but the number one for me was the...
Inside CISC takes you behind the scenes of one of the most iconic construction and engineering companies in Europe. This is a 165-year-old family business built on people.
To have a business that has the culture and the values, the strength of ours, particularly around care, that's probably unique, particularly in the construction world, but in any industry. We want our people to develop, we want to give them the responsibility, and we think that makes them thrive.
Places for the next generation, built on innovation. Find out more on Inside Cisc.
With MasterCard Priceless Experiences, the possibilities are endless.
You could be front row, screaming every lyric.
Or lost for words at the final act.
Shh. Sorry. Discovering new destinations.
Or a land of mouth-watering flavours.
So if you're a MasterCard cardholder, register at priceless.com to unlock a world of priceless experiences. From exclusive dining events to historic tours.
One place, endless possibilities. Priceless.
The concept about, the motivations of Justinian. And we've always looked at Justinian as almost a dreamer, like, dreaming the imperial dream of reconquering the West, of reuniting the empire. And what you propose is a much more realpolitik and even almost internal politics kind of decision-making that brought Justinian to the West. Do you want to, say what the central thesis there was?
Yeah, it's I've obviously been teaching Justinian all my life and been thinking about this, and it is the fact that he wants military glory. His hold on the throne is clearly, to start with, very weak. His uncle got to power via a coup d'état, essentially.
Yeah.
He wasn't. His uncle Justin wasn't meant to succeed. When Anastasius dies, there's clearly some very dodgy maneuvering going on in Constantinople and the court, and Justin emerges as emperor. And they're from a peasant background in Balkans. They're not normal court grandees. Justinian is able to get himself on the throne in the way that Anastasius's nephews hadn't been able to. But there's clearly a lot of opposition, and you still have Anastasius's nephews knocking around as very plausible alternative imperial candidates. Mm-hmm. So there's a tremendous drive in Justinian's early years to do something to show that he is the legitimate, i.e. God's choice of emperor, because this is what legitimacy means in the Roman context, is that you're so overwhelmingly successful that it's clear that you're God's choice. And he tackles that a number of ways. He starts his legal reforms very early on. That's very ambitious. And he starts military campaigning. But the military campaigning he starts is in the east against Persia. It's not in the west. Mm-hmm. And when you look at the accounts of how that war broke out, it really looks like he's stirring up trouble and making the war happen himself. He is the aggressor. The reigning Persian Shah asked if his choice of son and successor could be adopted as son-at-arms by the Roman state. And you get this absolute nonsense argument. We can't do that because it would give the Persian Shah's son a claim to the imperial throne in Constantinople. That is so much, I won't say BS.
I understand.
That is so much BS. This is a calculated insult to the Persian Shah. It's designed to stir up trouble inside the Persian Empire, and the Persian Shah naturally goes to war. But Justinian's caused it. In other words, we're seeing a deliberate attempt to, and actually for Constantinople, Persia is always the enemy of choice. The great victories are won over Persia. There's that very sniffy comment that Constantius II makes to Julian, saying, you only defeated a bunch of half-naked barbarians against the Alemanni. Come and try the Persians. It's essentially the message. That's the real enemy.
The real boss.
Yeah, absolutely. After the 3rd century traumas, which had seen 3 Roman imperial armies massacred by the Persians are the people who matter. So you then look at the more detailed events, and actually you find that Justinian is only willing to start moving towards the east after defeat. He's been defeated against Persia, and that defeat against Persia prompts the Nika riot, which turns into an attempt to unseat him. It burns down the great ceremonial centers of Constantinople. It's like burning down the middle of Rome or the middle of London. I always think it's like burning down that bit that runs from the Houses of Parliament in Westminster to Whitehall. It's like, it's like all of that is rubble at the end of it. You do not look like God's choice of emperor.
No.
When you've been defeated abroad, and the ceremonial center of the capital city is rubble. So Justinian survives the Nika riot, but only by sending in the troops. And we got two sources, and they're both contemporary sources. They both say between 10 and 20,000 people are killed in that week in Constantinople. A lot of them on the Sunday, when they're suckered into coming to the Hippodrome, and the imperial troops massacre them.
Yeah.
Justinian's regime is hanging by a thread, absolutely by a thread. And it's in this context when we start to see opportunity arise in Vandal Africa that he starts to become seriously interested in overseas adventurism as a way of winning that elusive victory, which will restore legitimacy to his rule. And even then, he progresses very slowly. It's very cautious.
But indeed, this is the interesting part, that it's basically an adventurism to the West in order to build consensus at home, which had been... So it's not an expansion on the back of being strong at home, as it's often portrayed to be the case. This is not the case at all. We have a situation where you've been defeated, you have massacred your own people, so creating quite a bit of resentment, I imagine, in some section of the population.
Absolutely, and
it's
very clear.
The center of the city is,
yeah.
And he indeed will remain fairly unpopular from what we can see all the way to the end. I mean, even after all his victories, he is never truly popular. It's hard to rebuild. We don't have polls for the time, but the impression I got also from reading your book and other books is that he's never actually so popular at home.
No, and the conquest policy starts out looking pretty good, but it's all right down to 540. But when you've taken over Vandal Africa and Witigis has surrendered in Italy, it looks like it's a worthwhile thing. But actually, there'll be two very big insurgencies in Italy and in Africa that last through most of the 540s. And then, because you've moved all your best troops to the west on these adventures, the Persians come and sack Antioch, which is the second biggest city of the empire. So in a sense, you could say that during Justinian's reign, we see the destruction not only of Constantinople, but also of Antioch, the two most important cities of the empire.
There's only Alexandria left, but Alexandria is hit early by the plague, so that will take care of that.
It's a reign of extremes, it's not a reign of untroubled success.
I will say, for me, it's incredible that not some big blockbuster has been made about this time, because I see it as ready to be produced. But okay, someone sooner or later will have the idea. I hope maybe will come out as decent.
Yeah, you could certainly do a very decent and not too expensive radio play, which would be very good.
Well, or a podcast, for example. But even TV series. You have all these characters larger than life, no? And even the side characters are there, because sometimes in some periods you have only the main, like the ruler. Yeah. But here we have all the side characters that are very interesting.
I do think even someone like Peter the Patrician, who's sent to stir up trouble at the Ostrogothic court. That's a fantastic episode right there.
Indeed, it's fantastic. I covered that too. Or what was the name? Libanius, the guy that goes around all the world. Or Narses and Belisarius, of course. But the wives, of course. And all the little people, like Tribonia. There's really a lot of characters.
There are.
So after a short technical break, we're back with Professor Hatter. By the way, Professor, for years on the podcast, I've called you Peter Heater. I apologize, but I learned the correct pronunciation and did a mea culpa. So,
yes, the A is silent. Yes.
yeah. So now I know. The next question is, I will say, about several of your works. And, I picked these three figures that are important in your works. Theoderic, of course, king of the Ostrogoths, king of Italy. And then Justinian, we just talked about, and Charlemagne. It seems, from your writing, all three of them, in some shape and form, are trying to recapture the Rome of old. Of course, Justinian is the only one of the three which is an actual Roman emperor. But they are trying to rebuild Rome as it once was. So what do they have in common? These three, of course, besides this, what I said, and in which way they differ?
Yeah, I think Theodoric and Justinian are probably more similar to each other, with Charlemagne more as an outlier, in the sense that the Roman imperial tradition is still very much alive in the early 6th century, late 5th and early 6th century, when in the lifetimes of Theodoric and Justinian. And Theodoric is coming to power in the first generation after there's been a Western Empire, and it's a series of contingent events, but he ends up being in charge of a good third of what used to be the Western Empire by the time that he's taken over the Visigothic kingdom in 511. And at that point, he really looks like he is going to be, he is the dominant figure. The thing that's always excited me about him and interested me is that Clovis, his contemporary, gets all the airtime in the histories, but that's only because of Charlemagne, looking back, actually.
Yeah, indeed.
Theodoric is much more important than Clovis in his lifetime. And that's, it seems to me that is just totally lost in the general literature.
There is a rediscovery of Theodoric, but for example, in Italy, it's still relatively, it was never thought as an important figure of Italian history, the same way that Clovis is, and I can tell because I live now in a Francophone country,
sure.
And they make a big deal about Clovis, and we Italians, we don't make a big deal about Theodoric. Okay, of course, there is the problem that, of course, Clovis has a more influence, let's say, because it continues the story, whereas the one of Theodoric is interrupted. However, it's still really important. And sorry if I interrupted your train of thought, but one thing that I noticed, for example, in archaeology, in the 50s and 60s, when they found something around this time, they will say was late 5th century sometimes, no? And then only afterwards, only recently, well, really, based on how it's built, it's really early 6th. There was just never like a strong connection with Theodoric in Italy, and it's only very recently being reevaluated, I think.
Yes, I think so too, and it wouldn't register in the kind of, in popular history, but in academic circles too, that extraordinary and I think extraordinarily wrong paper by Emiliano kind of relegates Theodoric as though arguing that the Italian senators were disconnected from his regime and hostile to it. It makes him seem like a marginalized invader, when actually that's simply wrong. I think it's demonstrably wrong. What we're seeing is a falling out at the end of his reign between highly integrated different factions at court, not a sort of long-standing strand of resistance on the part of native Italians to Theodoric's rulership. They accepted it and embraced it, and he advanced their interests very solidly over the course of his reign. So he does seem to me an absolutely fascinating character, and probably a very influential one. I'm just working with some archaeologists in the Czech Republic, and they found this extraordinary mausoleum, which is probably a royal burial center. And the closest thing to it is actually Theodoric's mausoleum in Ravenna, and it's going to belong to the Bruges or something from more or less the same date. So this is really interesting. I haven't seen it yet. I'm going to see it next May.
I didn't know about this. So they so they probably imitated the one in Ravenna or predates the one in Ravenna?
That's what they're wondering, yes. So we'll have to go and have a look. It's it's very interesting too, because it's actually it was the mound on which Napoleon stood at the Battle of Austerlitz to command his forces. But underneath this mound turned out to be this mausoleum. So it's a really great story with lots of dimensions of interest to it.
Wow. Now let's talk about history there. Wow. Of all the Napoleonic battles, if you have to pick one, that's a pretty cool one to be, because there's quite a few, but it has to be Austerlitz. Okay.
Yeah.
Fantastic. I didn't know, and it's now I'm very excited too. But
I didn't know about this until a couple of weeks ago. So
fantastic, very fresh out of the printer.
So, but anyway, going back to Theodoric, he and Justinian are both playing with reinventions of a very live tradition. Of course, the eastern half of the empire is still there, as you said, in the case of Justinian. And also, as we were talking about earlier, with the retreat of effective Western government towards Italy in the course of the 5th century, the idea of Italy, Africa, and the Eastern Empire makes a lot of, has living political traditions that Justinian could play with. Although, of course, they never had, they'd lost control of North Africa from 439 onwards in the 5th century, but the ease of connections between Italy and North Africa obviously make that very viable. So both of those, I think, are playing with a world where the memory of Rome is still it's still absent. It's not a memory. There's a very recent memory of the Western Empire, and the Eastern Empire is still a living entity. So the Roman imperial presence is colossal, and that seems to me is the big distinction with Charlemagne, in the sense that by his time, then even the Eastern Roman Empire is not what it had been. It's lost 3/4 of its territory and 3/4 of its revenues at the time of the Islamic invasions. I annoy a lot of Byzantinists, I know, but it seems to me that Constantinople, after the Islamic conquest, from the late 7th or early 8th centuries onward, is as much a successor state to the Roman imperial system as the Franks or the Visigoths or the Ostrogoths in the West. This really irritates people. So some people. So
I read it, and it's it struck me too as a point that would stir up some feelings, but also as something that it captures a reality. Indeed, I'm covering this time now, and you can see that the Roman Empire of Leo III is a very different beast. Even Constantinople is still a great city, although diminished, but all the rest is an empire of outposts. I read somewhere, I don't remember. I think I read it in the Caldellis last.
Yes,
book.
that sounds like Caldellis. Yeah, and I think that's not a bad way to think about it. It's almost a bit more like a sort of medieval Venetian empire than.
With bits and pieces here and there, connected by a web of maritime connections, more than a strong imperial land base. The only strong land core is Asia Minor, 2/3 of it, but the rest is like all bits and pieces, basically.
Yes, that's right. So Charlemagne is reinventing the Roman tradition. in that sense. So it's much more artificial and it's much more learned. It is interesting, though, that an awful lot of the texts about, that allow us to know about the late Roman Empire are copied quite early by Carolingian monks. So all these texts, like Dignitatum, Ammianus Marcellinus, they are Carolingian copies that ensure those texts' survival. So there is a kind of I don't know how deliberate it was, but there is a kind of interrogation of the past going on in the Carolingian enterprise, in the cultural side of it. And I think this does have consequences and is important because when Charlemagne is first stretching his hands out towards the imperial title in the 790s, he's clearly trying to establish himself as the only legitimate Roman emperor. So he is criticizing the terms on which Constantinople had overcome iconoclasm. He's saying that a woman can't be the person in charge. It's looking like a zero-sum game at that point. There can't be two emperors. There can only be me. It's kind of the trajectory of the argument that's there in the 790s. But the deal that's done by about 810 is actually saying there can be Eastern and Western emperors. Yeah. And I do wonder if it's more than an accident that the Notitia Dignitatum, which has Eastern and Western empires laid out in their full administrative form, is found and copied at the time. It's a really odd document, to copy. But I wonder if it actually provided the model. Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah. There can be Eastern and Western emperors.
That's a very interesting thought, because indeed that's the Notitia Dignitatum is something that we care enormously about, because I can tell how you and your colleagues, I don't want to put me on the same but it's something where you get so many information about but why would a Carolingian monk care about the Notitia Dignitatum, which is a very dry list of titles and provinces and troops. It's exactly the kind of stuff that interests historians but doesn't interest a monk.
No, exactly. They spend most of their time, the vast majority of the what we used to call the Carolingian Renaissance, what we now call correctio, is focused on religious matters.
Yeah, indeed.
95% of what they do is Christian.
And there's no Christianity here. There's nothing particular.
Not really. No.
Yeah.
So I think it's kind of interesting what Charlemagne means by the imperial title and what his court circle mean by it, because they start to talk about it explicitly from the early 790s. I do wonder if they'd been talking about it before that, but we just don't. There's not the evidence that would record. They clearly mean a kind of supra-regnal level of authority, so not just one kingdom, several states. That's one dimension of it, and I would have thought as soon as you kind of astonishingly quickly conquer the Lombards, as Charlemagne does, I wonder if they started thinking about it then. But it also has, the imperial title has the connotations of religious authority, and that's clearly very well understood both by the Pope and by Charlemagne himself.
And indeed
very
Charlemagne,
confident that the Pope didn't.
He thought about himself as the head of the church of his empire. Absolutely, this is something that comes out so clearly from. And because they always say, it's an alliance. Originally, the old history was an alliance between the lay, but he clearly feels like that he's the head of the church of his empire, and yes, there is an alliance with the most important bishop of that empire. But there is one that is above others, right?
That's right. But if you look at where all the decisions are taken. I mean, really important things happen in the development of Western Christendom in the later 8th and 9th centuries, so the period of Carolingian imperial greatness. But all the decisions are taken at Carolingian organized councils. They're not taken in Rome. And actually, all the money that's provided for church reorganization, all the key decisions like making cathedral schools and the bigger monastic schools new centers of Christian learning with a very clear curriculum. All of those things are decided by Carolingian churchmen, and popes are not invited to those meetings. They're not in on this. And actually, the main thing that we see going on in Rome is Charlemagne in particular, but also his father Pippin, had considerably enriched the papacy, but this just sparks horrible fights over who's going to be pope, because there's so much money involved, so they're all kind of in there, desperate to control this office, because it now is the head of a great multinational company.
Indeed, and there is a level of violence you don't see during the Byzantine time.
No.
When and before, you can really see, you can track, as the more it becomes independent, the Pope, in the late 7th, early 8th, and the more it becomes important with the association with the Franks, and the more we see violence to get access to this title, until the Carolingian basically say, you start squabbling, we will decide who will be the ultimate authority,
So, well, you can see how much money they've got to spend if you look at the lives of the popes from this period, restoration of aqueducts, new churches, enriching the major shrines with gifts of gold and silver. And they usually do the gold and silver by weight of gold and silver. These are extraordinary quantities of money that are coming in because of the enrichment that Charlemagne, in particular, has provided the see, and that just then makes it. This is a huge prize, so people are fighting to control it. They're desperate to control it. So, the papacy is in no position to provide international ecclesiastical leadership. That all comes from the Carolingian court.
It's very fascinating. I studied a bit the 11th and 12th century, which were not an area where I usually inhabited, because I wrote a book about the Fourth Crusade. So, which has not come out yet. So I had to, for all the background. And I had a realization, and I proposed to you. Let's see if... And unfortunately, I haven't read your book yet, which is my next purchase. Christendom 300 to 1300. It's such a great title and such a great way of putting it. So, and my realization was that Catholicism really was born in the 11th century. So the way, that kind of religion, which then will split in, the Western Christianity, then will split in Protestant and Catholic pieces much further on. But I really came out, okay, so it's really here with the Gregorian reform. But before going there, I just wanted to ask you, what is that brought you to write an history about these 1,000 years of Christian history, and why 300 and 1,300? Why the beginning and the end?
Yeah, sure. It's exactly the issue that you've just pointed out. Obviously, I been teaching religious courses for more years than I care to remember, but it was the feeling that people who should know better actually use this singular term, this singular noun, Christianity, as though we know what it is. And it's always been the same. But actually, I know very well from the materials that I taught with. And then, in fact, in the end, I designed a couple of courses, one for undergraduates and one for master's students, to help me write the book, to make me learn about the things I didn't know enough about. So that's what I do as a teacher. You go off and read. I create a course, of course, to make me go off and read.
Yeah, because then you need to study to do the course. Then during the course, maybe if something comes out, during the course. That's a good point. Right.
Yeah, no, right. So, but actually, Christianity was very different before Constantine, in the late Roman period, in the post-Roman period, and then this new era of reform that the Carolingians kick in place. And then the papacy from the late 11th and particularly the 12th centuries picks up. So, and that I would date it in a sense slightly later than you, Catholicism. I think Catholicism emerges in reality in the course of the 12th century. And when you read the book, you'll see why I think that. But yeah, no, absolutely agree. So most people talk about Christianity as though they think it is the 12th century incarnation, and it's always been that. But actually, it's massively different. And the reason I picked the two dates is that the process that fundamentally changes Christianity, I think, is turning it into a mass organized religion.
Yeah. And that's Constantine and
that starts with Constantine. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Before Constantine, Christian numbers are tiny. You've got autonomous, self-governing communities that are very small, dotted around the Mediterranean, and they're very intense true believers, you know. So the standards of behavior required and the standards of commitment required are extremely high.
Yeah.
These are people who might be martyred, or if they're not willing to be martyred, they'll be kicked out. And then you have to decide what you're going to do with people who refuse to stand up to persecution. That's a big issue in the 3rd century churches and again in the early 4th century. So it is the Constantinian, I mean, it's not that Constantine has a plan, but bringing Christianity into the state, and eventually it becomes the state religion by the end of the 4th century, that transforms Christianity massively. And I did it deliberately because I felt that this is one area where the work of the guy has been sort of great hidden inspiration, not very hidden actually, but great inspiration. Peter Brown is not right, because he doesn't he doesn't talk about states. And I actually think the integration of Christianity into the state changes Christianity. He likes to talk about late Roman and early medieval history, the late antiquity, without talking about states, because he wants to get past narratives of decline and fall, and I'm happy with that part. But where a weakness comes in is that he's not seeing that cultural history doesn't exist independently of state structures and their transformations, and that actually, in the case of Christianity, you can make a really good argument, well, I've tried to make what I think is a really good argument, that actually becoming the Roman state religion is a crucial moment in the formation of Christianity.
We used to talk a lot about the Christianization of the Roman Empire, but the Romanization of the Christian religion is probably even more important. It really comes out.
It's at least as important. You've got two structures that are changing each other, and the transformation in Christianity is more dramatic, I think, than the transformation in the Roman state. I mean, the Romans just basically changed the name of the god, and that's it. Thanks a lot.
New business in town. New management. But
under new management.
Under new management. But yes, indeed, the Christianity of the martyrs. It's really a cult. You can see it as it's really intense, as you were saying, and then by the 4th century you already start seeing how it's it's a state, so everything that is state, there is an element of ceremony and an element of convenience in being part of it.
Things, early pre-Constantinian Christianity was all about getting your soul into heaven, not interested in the things of this world in the slightest. Didn't do marriage. There are no Christian marriage prayers or before the late 4th century. In fact, the pre-Constantinian church's tendency was to celebrate virginity, not having the kind of normal ties that most people form in the course of an ordinary life towards partnerships and children. They're just a distraction. The apocalypse is coming. You need to get your soul in a state that it will go to heaven. That's
right now, because there is this sense of urgency. The apocalypse is coming momentarily. It's like the Adventists today. I studied a bit about the Adventists today. It's now, it's coming now. Or Islam, also in the 7th century. You can really feel how in Islam, this was a really intense belief of the apocalypse being very close, maybe in our lifetime, or probably in our lifetime. So I can see the parallelism there. And then a question is, why 1,300 for the end?
Yeah, the other end is that the book defines 3 moments or 3 periods of transformation within Christianity: the late Roman, immediately post-Roman, and then this Carolingian and after period. And to my mind, there is another crucially transformative period in the creation of essentially what we will call the Roman Catholic Communion. So medieval Latin Christianity, starting in the late 11th, but really coming through the 12th as well, where it's kind of, it seems to me it's a kind of important alliance between the emergence of the papacy as an authority structure that can validate certain ways of being as correct, the only way to do it, and an incredibly creative intellectual process that comes through the creation of the university, the emergence of universities in the 12th century, which move Christians. I mean, astonishingly, truly astonishingly, there was no received view of the afterlife and what was going to happen before the 12th century. It's only in the 12th century that you get a coherent vision that actually there are three destinations, potential destinations, heaven, hell, and purgatory in between. And most people are going to end up in purgatory, which will be absolutely horrible, but heaven will be at the end of that nasty process. And here's a whole list of things that you can do here and now and that your relatives can do after your death to shorten the time in purgatory. That whole system is created particularly in Paris, in the universities. And actually then the papacy validates it, above all, Innocent III in the Fourth Lateran validates that as the way forward. And it becomes a new regime of piety. But none of that can work without the other Carolingian reforms, which build loads of churches. You know, before 900, there aren't many churches. The Carolingians put in place the financial incentives, which mean that landowners build churches. Even in Italy, you know, one Italian diocese, sorry, I can't pull out the name, but, you know, standard Italian sort of place goes from having 40 churches to 400 churches in the 10th century. And that's absolutely spot on. Most of Western Christendom is like that. England's a bit later.
Like 10 times the number of church, because before the churches were mostly like the church in the city. No, there would be the cathedral in the city and a couple of other churches in the city, and then the countryside doesn't matter.
There are a few churches, but you know, in Gregory of Tours' diocese in the 6th century, it's been, because it gives you a lot of information. You can tell that it's been calculated that people live on average about 10 kilometers from a church. Well, if they're living 10 kilometers from a church, they're not going, because it's a 20-kilometer walk there and back. So you know, they might go twice or 3 times a year, but they are not regularly going to church. So you can only have this more intense form of piety about getting people out of purgatory and into heaven when you're providing them with a church and with a priest and with, you know, the place to have it. So the reason I take it down to 1300 is that the kind of enforcement mechanisms for this new pattern of lay piety, which is still actually the standard pattern in the Roman Catholic Communion, is created by about 1200, but takes another 100 years to be enforced. You know, so that's why I go to 1300 to move it forward, to look at the actual enforcement process of this new clever idea of Christianity. So.
Yeah, a new Christianity of the 13th century.
Yeah, absolutely new Christianity, completely unrecognizable.
Unrecognizable. With the one before. Also, everything before I get the sense that there was much more important the apocalypse and what will happen after the apocalypse. But talking about there's not really, as far as I've got, any mention of the afterlife. What really matters is the resurrection after the end of the world. But that is there from much older time. And you confirmed to me that Innocent III is absolutely central, because of course I covered him connected to the Fourth Crusade, but yes, it's absolutely massive figure in history for several reasons. To close, Professor Heather, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. I could stay here for hours, but I can't finish without playing a little games. Short, you know. So, and the little game is just to say, okay, now we've done the serious part, so let's do the a bit more gamey part. And it is, if you had to pick, I will say, your favorite emperor one in the East, one from the classical Roman time and one from the medieval part of history, which one will be? And favorite doesn't have to be the best, but you know, often is, but it doesn't have to. Who will you pick and why?
Oh my goodness, that's a very interesting question. Well, in the later period, I'd certainly pick Theodoric. Actually, I think he's such an interesting figure. So clever, so lucky, simultaneously. A man who rides his luck. He might have lost out in the Balkans to his namesake, also confusingly called Theodoric.
I know, Theodoric the Strabo. He could have been another Strabo, right? Instead, he manages to become a de facto Western Roman emperor. It's a really fascinating. When I daydream, I think, what if Theodoric, heirs would have become, the jure Roman emperors, no? Then we will have another dynasty, no? And who knows? Then?
Absolutely. If Justinian doesn't lose to the Persians and therefore doesn't launch these Western campaigns, then we wouldn't have to write about all these wretched Franks all the time. It would be the Ostrogothic Italian kingdom would be the dominant force, and that would be absolutely fascinating. And these wonderful buildings at Ravenna, Santa Molinari is just amazing. If the palace still stood as well, if we had the entire complex, that would be quite something. But anyway, so I think I would certainly go with that. Earlier emperors, interesting. Who would I pick and why? I think I'd go with a failure. Actually, I'd be very interested to be able to. Well, in a sense, it's more this time who I'd like to know more about, and it would be Decius, who's the first emperor who's killed by Goths in the middle of the 3rd century, because I'd like to know more about. I mean, there've been a few extra fragments of Dexibus that have been found very recently.
Yes, indeed.
Some new light on that era, and we talked about this extraordinary rush of gold that suddenly appears in Barbaricum just after Decius' defeat. I think getting a sense of what the empire was really like, what's going on in the Danube, what do these Gothic groups that are moving into the region actually look like? How big are they? Are they all coming with their women and children, which I think they were, but were they really? All of this, to know more about that would be fascinating.
And what about your religion's policy to Decius? I imagine you will make also that question. What were you trying to do with these Christians?
No. There's a smell of exciting crisis about that reign, which would draw me in.
I wrote another book. My first book was about the crisis of the 3rd century. So, of course, it's all in Italian. Otherwise, I was. That's why I know about the Xipus fragment that was discovered recently. With the story of the battle that we didn't know, in Greece. I think that's what you were referring to.
Yes, it is. And also confirming a bit more about the kind of leadership that the Goths had. That's another dimension of interest in that story.
Yeah. And you also wrote, and this is another piece of work that unfortunately I haven't read yet, but because it's about the future. So you also wrote it will take me a few decades to get there eventually, but I will get there. But you wrote also a book about the, basically the topic that all people that study the fall of the Roman Empire have always wondered about since the beginning, since the first time that they thought about it. What about me? Is it telling something about me, basically? No? They always think like, what? And today, really that relates to the West, and more specifically with the most important country in the West, which is the US. So my question is, what were your finding in that book about what the fall of the Roman Empire can say about us? And is us also Europe, or are we on? And this is the second part of the question: are we now only object and not subject of history?
The central argument of the book is, and I wrote it with a friend of mine who's a modern political economist, is actually picking up this strand in my work, which runs through most of it, really, and that is the effect that empires have on less developed areas around them. And the fundamental argument is that the kind of transformations that a big imperial system has on the world around it make it difficult for that imperial system to continue to exist. Basically, processes of economic, social and political and even cultural development that are set loose around the fringes of an empire create entities which blunt the edge of imperial power. And this is what I think happens with the Roman world, both in the case of Persia in the east and the various confederations in Europe, most of them Germanic speaking, but not all, that you actually see a transformation in the course of the Roman period towards that change the strategic context to such a substantial extent that you can no longer be the kind of empire that you were. And I felt that this is very much what's going on in the modern West as well. We've set in motion, and I think at the moment at least I'd bracket America and Europe together, and even Britain post-Brexit, I still bracket in here. We've changed the world around us. We've generated processes of development in China and India, in South America, but also elsewhere. Actually, most of the world's, 7 out of 10 of the world's fastest growing economies are currently in Africa. That mean that the Western economic dominance of the planet is being changed. Not really because we're falling apart. We've stopped getting richer to the extent that we were getting richer, but what's really happening is that the rest of the world is getting richer relative to us. And, military and political power is only money plus a generation. That's all it is.
Fantastic. That is a fantastic quote. Money plus a generation. Indeed, because there is that accumulated knowledge, but it's only lasts a generation, right? That you still keep an edge.
Absolutely. There's kind of inertia and there's habit and there's, it takes a while to decide what to buy with your money. But, power is only money plus a bit of time. That is all it is. That's all it's ever been. So if you change the balance of economic power across the planet, and we've been instrumental in doing that, it's Western investment that allowed China to explode and India to explode and whatever, they've got their own momentum now, but originally an awful lot of Western funds lie behind that. Then you're changing the strategic balance of power and you can't put it back. I mean, that's the point. That's the point we're trying to argue in the book. It's identify that actually it's not what's happening in the West that has changed the balance of power, not primarily. It's what's happened in the developing world. That's true of the Roman Empire too. It's also true more broadly of Europe in the first millennium, I would argue. And once you realize that, then you have to start your decision making from that reality, not pretend that you can go back to the situation in the second half of the 20th century when Europe has destroyed itself in 2 wars. The rest of the world is still only growing stuff, so America is the world's industrial manufacturing superpower because it's the only place that's doing it. You'll never go back to that situation. It cannot ever exist again. It's an accident. It's like
an accident of history.
It's like the accident that Britain has the Industrial Revolution first. So in the 19th century, Britain is the only place making things. Well, Britain is it's a medium-sized island just off the European coast. The idea that this will be the center of world domination forever is ludicrous. It's just a moment where a certain set of accidents happen. So when you realize that, you then have to make sensible decision making, not trying to put the clock back. You can't make America or Britain or Rome great again by adopting some kind of bizarre policy run, because it can't be like that. The world is different. The tectonic plates of the world economy have moved. Strategic power follows it. Make sensible decisions from now, not looking back in the past.
Yes.
So that's the argument of the book.
Without reading it, I kept nodding because I could absolutely subscribe to anything that you've said, and I have thought about things like that. Often when I talk to Americans, because my wife is American, so I go often to the US and say, because it says it's just normal, it's life. America used to be so important after the war because of what happened. The trajectory, you can beat it for a few decades. There can be contingency reasons why, but the trajectory inevitably flows in that direction. But that doesn't mean that you are getting that there will be a disaster. And usually
America will be rich and important forever, probably.
Yeah, forever. Even
as long
if
as they don't do anything stupid.
As long as they don't do anything stupid, exactly. So the like a nuclear war, for example. But because I'm very worried about this. I think we are in a Thucydidean trap, and I could point out the place where the war will start, which is Taiwan. And because there are all the ingredients for in a confused situation where nobody really understands where each other is standing, I can totally see an accident happening there and ballooning out of proportion. So if we can avoid that, at the end, there's no reason why less important in percentage to the total means a lower quality of life. You can actually have a much better quality of life only in a world which together has a better quality of life. So
that's right. I totally agree with you. There are very clear dangers, but there are also pathways to a more stable, more equal wealth across the globe could generate greater stability. Slight decline in numbers of human beings overall, which seems that we're on that trajectory. That can't be bad either. That will help with environment and resources and pollution. Those are potentially the pathways to a different world order, but not a bad one.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Professor Hatter. We went from late antiquity to the 22nd century, I think. So we were talking about 100 years from now, I think, in the last few minutes.
No, I think so. By the time the population trends really kick in, it will be another 100 years.
Yeah, because it will keep growing probably for another 50 years, but then it will start declining. This is another thing that very few people have understood, I think, that don't pay attention, is that actually this incredible population growth is coming to an end. And there are very clear signs that this is the case. And everybody still thinks like, oh my God, there is an explosion of population, but that's not the truth. And anyways.
No, and the other thing that is really interesting is the extent to which, with aging populations, the Western world relies on a flow of immigration, and there won't be any in 20 years.
Exactly. Right now, we are also worried about this. And I think in 20, 30 years, we will be begging people to come.
Absolutely. I think we'll be having to pay them. Yeah, I think there will be a competition for migrants.
Can you come? We'll give you money to come. And it would, all these decades of turmoil about immigration will look very silly then. But,
I think so. I absolutely think so, yes.
Thank you so much, Professor Hatter. It has been more than a pleasure, double honor in Cubic. To have you with me.
Well, it's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. E questo è quanto. Vi ricordo che il 18 di dicembre sarò a New York e l'8 gennaio sarò ad Houston, quindi se mi ascoltate dagli Stati Uniti, lo so, gli Stati Uniti sono un paese grande, ma insomma se mi ascoltate dallo stato di New York e dal Texas centrale, Insomma, avete delle ottime occasioni per venire ad incontrarmi dal vivo e sarei veramente onorato di parlare con voi. Tra l'altro, per chi vuole, possiamo anche restare dopo gli eventi per farci una chiacchierata tra amici. Comunque sia, vi ringrazio per l'ascolto e vi rimando alla prossima puntata extra che spero di far uscire già durante le feste natalizie, così da non lasciarvi soli per troppo tempo. Grazie mille per l'ascolto e alla prossima puntata!
KFC, why not do Kentucky Fried Turkey for Christmas?
I'd devour a KFC turkey sambo.
KFT, stop the lights.
Go on, KFC. Give the people what they want. We want turkey.
Ireland, we heard you, and we're ignoring you. At KFC, we're sticking with chicken. Introducing our limited edition stuffing stacker burger, featuring 2 crispy original recipe chicken fillets, spicy cranberry sauce, cheese and sage and onion stuffing. Grab it before it goes.
Inside CISC takes you behind the scenes of one of the most iconic construction and engineering companies in Europe. This is a 165-year-old family business built on people.
To have a business that has the culture and the values, the strength of ours, particularly around care, that's probably unique, particularly in the construction world, but in any industry. We want our people to develop, we want to give them the responsibility, and we think that makes them thrive.
Places for the next generation, built on innovation. Find out more on Inside CISC.